Welcome, everyone, to the Climate Jobs and Just Transition Summit, hosted by Climate Jobs New York, Climate Jobs New York Education Fund, the Worker Institute, and the Lois Gray Labor Innovation Initiative at Cornell University's ILR School, and the Climate Jobs National Resource Center. My name is Mijin, and I'm an assistant professor at Occidental College and a fellow at the Worker Institute. I'm thrilled and honored to be moderating this spectacular panel to talk about securing an effective just transition. What do we want and how do we win it? Here in California, we've had a month of wildfires, record heat, and record hazardous air. As you've been hearing all throughout this day, this is just one example of the climate crisis. Hurricanes, record rainfall, and extreme weather events are happening all over the country and all over the world. We are no longer fighting to stop climate change. Climate change is here. But we still have time to stop the worst impacts of climate change if we can drastically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. To do so, we need to stop extracting and using fossil fuels. While this is what we need to do to stop the worst impacts of climate change, we must also recognize that there will be job and revenue loss as fossil fuels are deeply embedded into our economy. The question then becomes, how do we mitigate these losses and make workers and communities whole? The idea of just transition, as thought of by the late great labor leader Tony Mazzocchi and environmental justice advocates, is based on the principle that workers and communities should not bear the burden of these transitions that our economies and societies are experiencing. But we know that while the principle is straightforward, actualizing a just transition is difficult and complicated. Luckily, we have a stellar lineup today to talk through these issues. Our panel today will talk about just transition efforts at the international, national, and state level, what is necessary and how to achieve it. Joining us today are Bautista, Executive Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, Michael Guerrero, Executive Director, Labor Network for Sustainability, John J. Murphy, International Representative, United Association of Journeymen and Apprentice of the Plumbing and Pipe Fitting Industry of the US and Canada, and Samantha Smith, Director of the Just Transition Center. We will start with opening statements from each of our panelists and then move directly to questions and discussion. We will be taking audience questions during the discussion. If you would like to submit a question for our panelists, please follow the instructions on your screen to join the Q&A with your mobile device. You can either scan the QR code that appears, or if it's easier, just go to slido.com on your phone and type in climate jobs. And those details will be displayed periodically throughout the panel. So without further delay, I'll turn it over to Samantha to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Mijin. So good morning, afternoon, or even evening to everyone who's joining us today. And thanks very much for the invitation to talk about Just Transition. So just to situate myself and what I do, I work for the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global federation for most of the world's unions. We represent more than 200 million organized working people in 162 countries, I think. In 2016, the ITUC set up the Just Transition Center. We're not a think tank. We are set up to be a global resource center to help unions and their allies get good plans for just transition. A good plan for just transition does two things. It brings down emissions consistent with the Paris Agreement, ideally, and it improves the material conditions of workers. Just to give you some examples of what we do and also what just transition looks like outside of the United States. So we work basically only with unions in high emitting sectors. So that would be mining, including coal, power, oil and gas, steel, cement, auto, construction, transport, and so on. Just transition in this context has two important parts. So one is, let's say you are in Bulgaria and you're going to move from having mostly coal-fired power as well as conventional steel production to having low emissions power and low emissions production of steel. So what are all the things that you would need to do for people who today are working in coal mines and coal-fired power stations and for the community that surrounds them, right? Because, people are employed in the community, there might be tax revenues, and also they're creating other indirect economic activity in the community. And for workers, you would need a plan for each worker, right? So for older workers, a bridge to pension, ideally. For younger workers, placement in a new job of equivalent or better quality So that's security of contract, it's wages and conditions, skills and training, safety, and so on. And then also a plan to create other kinds of jobs in the community, so jobs in schools and hospitals, investment in community infrastructure, so that that community is a good place to live and stay and work also in the future when the mine closes down. That's one part of just transition. And we work a lot with energy unions on exactly these parts of it. And then the other part is more in the realm of climate jobs. So what we always say is there need to be new jobs, and the new jobs need to be good jobs. Because what we see again and again is that when you're shutting down the higher emitting industries, then often the new companies are anti-union, they're union busting, and the jobs are not of the same quality. I guess the other things I want to say about just transition are, first of all, that there are international rules for it. So UN body, the International Labor Organization, which is employers and unions and governments, they've negotiated a global standard for just transition. It's pretty broad, but there's one thing about every just transition process that actually makes it a just transition, and that is that it has unions at the table and the voice of working people in the process. So depending on what country you're in, that could just be unions and employers and government. In other countries, it can be unions, employers, government, communities at the same table. In all countries, there's always either a combined or separate process for people in communities and for civil society. I guess the other thing to say about just transition is it's possible. So, for example, in Germany, they have just concluded all the legislation and federal investment in a just transition plan for the entire coal sector in the country. They're going to phase out all nuclear power and all thermal coal by 2038 while replacing it with renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so on. And the good things about this plan from our perspective, unions were definitely at the table negotiating it, including the mining and energy unions. There is a plan for every single worker who is today employed in thermal coal in the mines and power plants. The federal government's going to put 40 billion euro into the coal-producing, coal-dependent regions of Germany. Now, not all of this is related to just transition. Some of these are previous parts of East Germany, where there has been no real investment in infrastructure for 30 years, right? So people are finally going to get like decent broadband, they're going to get high-speed rail, a bunch of other things. But it's a pretty comprehensive plan for the people working there, for their families, and for the community. And then in addition, in the rest of the plan, there are a bunch of sort of stabilizing measures at different points to make sure that things are on track. And two of the key things that will need to be on track is, number one, energy prices will not go up for poor and working class households. And two, energy prices for German industry won't go up so much that it becomes uncompetitive, right? So it's a great plan. But there are plans in other countries in Europe, in New Zealand, we've got them at the state level, in Australia, and of course up in Canada, where they also have plans at the provincial level for the phase out of thermal coal. It is not just our brothers and sisters in the union movement in northern countries that are doing this. Earlier today, I was in another discussion with the comrades from the unions in South Africa and Brazil, who are also working on just transition. So just to say that this is a global approach that the labor movement has adopted. The work is happening on the ground. It's happening at different scales, from cities to states and regions to national level. We're working at these different scales with unions in different sectors. And what we see is that when the alternative to changing or even closing down a mine or a power plant is not unemployment and maybe benefits if you're lucky, but when it's real solutions where our people are at the table negotiating them, people shift and they want that change. And I guess the last thing to say is that if you today are a worker employed in a fossil fuel company, you don't necessarily want that company to go under and have its assets stripped, right? You kind of like it to stay afloat and keep employing you and your mates. But it would be totally fine if that company transformed and became a low-emitting company. And since the labor movement is a democratic movement, we're trying to deliver those kinds of solutions for our members. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Now I'll turn to Michael.
Thank you, Mijin. Great to be here, and thank you to Climate Jobs New York and the National Climate Jobs Center for organizing this conference and inviting us to be part of this. My name is Michael Leon Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director of the Labor Network for Sustainability. We're a national network of individuals, unions, organizations, and allies. And our mission is to build a movement that's environmentally sustainable and economically just. So this question of just transition is something we've been grappling with for many years. A couple of years ago, we wrote a book called Just Transition, Just What Is It?, which actually did interviews of people in various movements to understand what their perspectives were on just transition. And we know it's not an easy topic. It's been controversial. It's been politically charged in sectors of the labor movement. So it's great to see, first of all, that it's actually part of the title of this conference, and that we're having a deeper conversation around it. And I think it's one of many that are starting to take place. Environmentalists are increasingly recognizing and understanding the importance of just transition as policies are being developed, including whether it's the Green New Deal, whether it's Biden's platform. More and more, we're seeing just transition language being incorporated into those agendas. And of course, the problem is that economic transitions have not been handled well historically in this country, certainly not at the national level. And with the pandemic and the economic crisis that we're facing, millions of people out of work and many of those jobs not coming back, this issue is reaching a new scale and urgency. And then also there's such a broad range of perspectives on just what just transition is. So we wanted to dig deeper into these conversations in the workplace and the community and hear from people, from workers themselves, community leaders, labor leaders, about their own stories. And so we started this project back in May. We kicked off the Just Transition Listening Project. And it's a project to hear from workers, labor leaders, community people about what their experiences have been going through an economic transition, if they're going through it now or they're facing one in the future. Our goal was to do 100 interviews. We're about at 80 now, and our goal was to finish by the end of next week, at the end of September. So we'll be close. We may not make the 100, but we're getting there. And so far, we've interviewed people from 21 states and the District of Columbia, a range of sectors and industries, including workers in oil refineries, in the building trades, utilities, auto manufacturing, transit, healthcare, agriculture, indigenous leaders and activists. And because we wanted to get that range of perspectives, because there have been so many different experiences and understandings about transition. And then the other thing that we've been doing is a series of webinars. Some of you may have tuned into those. We did one on the pandemic and the economic crisis. We did one on Black workers and just transition. We did one with the Just Transition Alliance, which was founded in 1997 as a partnership between the environmental justice movement and the oil, chemical, and atomic workers at the time, later PACE, and then later United Steelworkers, and a really critical example of partnerships between community and labor at the time around just transition. We did one webinar on young workers and just transition, and then we actually have one coming up next, partnering with the Climate Justice Alliance to talk about our power communities and their concept. And so all of these have been really helping us to learn a lot and actually dig deeper because, there are some basic things that we could understand about just transition and what's needed. And I think a lot of those things are being incorporated into policy now, in terms of the kind of safety nets and the training that's needed. But there are deeper stories too. And I think one of the real valuable things about this project is hearing people's personal histories and how they've been grappling with these questions as they've gone through these transitions. What we hope to do next is release our findings and recommendations at the end of December or in December, beginning of December. We're hoping to actually do a congressional briefing at the beginning of December as well. And then we want to get these stories out there. So we want to work with our folks that have done these interviews and really share some of the rich learnings and their experiences, and then also continue to develop the network of folks and have people, workers, and communities actively engaged in dealing with transitions in their communities. So I'll just say a little bit, without going into the findings. We got a team with folks, including Mijin, who are actually putting together findings and recommendations over the next couple of months. But just a few things, some things that people already know. We're very far from where we need to be to really have an effective just transition in this country at the scale that we're facing. The lack of the social safety net, healthcare, unemployment benefits, all of those things, we are woefully inadequate. NAFTA is something that comes up frequently with workers. That experience for people in paper mills, the auto industry, on and on and on. It was just poorly handled and left a lot of workers and communities hanging. Something that Samantha already mentioned, but jobs first and training later, right? So many experiences of workers that have been trained to take other jobs, and then there's no work on the other end, or really work that's not meaningful after being in highly skilled industries and training and prepping for careers. And then there's there's deeper work that's needed. And one of the examples I always lift up is about Massachusetts. And the fact that they have what the labor movement has actually put together to support workers and communities through the transition. They actually have an emergency response team that goes into factories that are going to be shut down, and they do deep work interviewing the workers themselves, helping to connect them to resources. That level of deep interaction and engagement and ownership for workers and communities is really missing in most places. And it's the labor movement that's providing that in the state of Massachusetts. And I think it's a terrific model to look at. And then strong worker protections and rights to organize obviously is going to be real critical because we've been, all of those protections have been rolled back, and I'm sure that's been talked about a lot today. And then the last thing I'll say is the generational aspects of it. So the impact on young workers in particular is something that, I think that is really striking. On the one hand, younger workers are they're very attuned to what's happening in terms of climate change issues. They talk to their peers a lot that are in some of the movements and organizations dealing with climate. So they deeply understand this. And but at the same time, these are folks that have actually gone through, in some cases in our interviews, workers that, this is the first really good job they've had in their family, right? And they were expecting to have a career here for a long time. And they're the ones now, because they don't have the option to retire out, that are really facing the reality of what it's going to mean to transition out of this job into something else. So, but they're thinking about it, and they're looking around and trying to figure out, how they can deal with this on an individual level, but also, thankfully, thinking about it at a movement level as well. So we're looking forward to getting more information out about this project over the next few months. And I'll stop there and happy to answer questions as we go forward. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And I think that's a really great segue into John Murphy talking about workers.
Good afternoon, Mijin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Climate Jobs New York and to the Worker Institute of Cornell for providing a forum for this critically important conversation. We realize, I'll say, from an industry that represents more than 350,000 members in the United States and Canada, heavily weighted in energy production, climate change is real. And it's not a binary choice. It's not either you're for or against. So it's important to be able to have these conversations to learn more about some of the issues that are affecting us every day. We realize that we have to have a conversation and try to remove the emotion. Climate change is personal to so many people. And it seems to me, in my experiences in speaking at some city and state hearings, that there are some groups that have made up their mind and don't want to listen to the facts, as opposed to listening to the facts to determine where we stand and how we can move forward. And the best way to really achieve any type of movement, positive change, is to build a consensus. So it doesn't have to be, hey, this industry is going to be eradicated and this industry will survive and will create new jobs. If we just take a broader view of renewable energy, if the state takes a broader view, considering biogas, biomass, and hydrogen, one only needs to look to all over the world, Europe, in Denmark, where hydrogen has become the forefront. Years ago, they were the foremost leaders in offshore wind. I believe their first wind farm was in 1992. When we traveled with the Climate Jobs group 2 years ago, they had said to us, oh, no, we're already moving past offshore wind. So right now, the offshore wind investments that are taking place are used solely to produce green hydrogen. Green hydrogen has zero carbon emissions. So the byproduct, it's a matter of separating hydrogen from water, and the byproduct is oxygen. And it's something that many of the companies are starting to transition to. So when we say, what's a transition? There's worker transitions, there's industry transitions, there's also company transitions. So Denmark Oil and Natural Gas is Ørsted, biggest supplier of offshore wind turbines in the world. So we need to look at the companies like BP, front page of the Washington Post yesterday, how they're starting to focus on renewables. So I believe if we take at least a broader view of renewable energy and the state recognizes those energy credits, we'll be able to transition for the workers in the industry to continue to work. But a priority must be, and based on a lot of the information that we saw after the NYSERDA white paper, that with the implementation of the CLCPA, with Local Law 97 calling for the rapid electrification of buildings, you add in the closing of Indian Point in 2021, the reliance on fossil fuel plants in New York City is going to go from 69% to 94%. One of our first priorities, if this is a fact, one of our first priorities would be to make sure that we make them more energy efficient. We should be retrofitting these plants. That's the transition. That's the bridge till we can get to renewable energy. And renewable energy, again, my feeling, if we include hydrogen in the mix, relating to hydrogen, I don't know if I already said it, that Denmark has taken the subsidies away from offshore wind and solar and actually putting it towards green hydrogen emergence. So it's great to have this conversation to better understand we're all on the same side. And as I've said to you, it's a very emotional and a very personal topic for so many. But if we can just broaden our view, I think we can actually bring more people under the tent.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And I really appreciate your framing that we are all on the same side. And now I'll turn to Eddie.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Eddie Bautista. I'm with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, the citywide coalition of community-based organizations from the city's most environmentally overburdened communities. We were founded in 1991. Our kind of just transition path, we've been working on a variety of initiatives over the years that we, characterize and see very much as a just transition fight. But the current iteration of that fight really stems from the People's Climate March in 2014 that Michael and so many of us worked on to pull off. It was not only at the time the largest climate march in history, it was the largest climate mobilization by a variety of sectors, including labor, like 15,000 sisters and brothers from the labor movement that marched with us. What we saw at the time with the march was that like any other aspect of movement work, it was a tool, right? We were using it not only to urge action that ultimately, yielded the Paris Climate Accords, but we saw it very much as a template and a call for action at all levels of government. So by the end of 2015, for example, in fact, the morning of the march, we, were grateful to see at the time the city administration lay out a new standard for New York City, something like 80% emissions reductions by 2050, which at the time was a groundbreaking goal that became a template for other large cities. But it was one thing to get a goal established in New York City, but what can we do statewide? And by the end of 2015, a number of us who were involved in the march started talking about, well, how can we take the energy and the focus of the march and translate that into, from our perspective, a just transition approach for the state. the other thing was kind of driving us was at the time there was a foundation leader who was talking to a number of our groups about the possibility of pursuing a cap and dividend approach in New York State, essentially establishing a cap on emissions and using the revenues that will be generated from that and returning those dollars directly to New Yorkers. And we didn't think that was a just transition approach, right? Like we thought if we're going to go down a road of an emissions mandate, coupled with some sort of carbon pricing, if we weren't taking the revenues and directing them to a just transition framework, we would be losing not just enormous opportunities, but in fact missing the point altogether, right? So in 2015, a number of us, like most good movement stories, it started with a road trip. My organization, Mijin, and Align New York and Working Families and several others did a road trip. And for anybody who knows New York, a guy from Brooklyn, anything north from the Bronx is considered upstate. So we went on a trip, and we visited advocates in Buffalo and Binghamton and Syracuse. And what emerged from those conversations was an agreement or a sense that we all knew that we needed to act together, whether we were talking about labor. And by the way, also a shout out and thank you to Climate Jobs and Worker Institute, who we consider key partners of ours in this fight for just transition from New York. We realized that not only, it was one thing to have EJ leaders and folks who were impacted in New York, in Buffalo, but it was really eye-opening to hear rural activists also talk about how Hurricane Lee affected them. We knew about Hurricane Sandy, right? And for us, with that across-state conversation led to the founding of New York Renews. I just dropped the link in the chat. And New York Renews is a statewide, now over 200 member coalition of community groups across the state, labor unions, a variety of different sectors and stakeholders, all united to push the state in that direction. What emerged out of the founding of New York Renews at the end of 2015 was a legislative platform. And that legislative platform had two components to it. One was what became the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that the legislature passed last year. Still the most ambitious climate action plan by any of the states. It calls for 100% net zero emissions reduction economy-wide. I want to say that again, economy-wide for New York State by 2050. Because for us, any talk about pricing, again, misses the mark if we're not starting the conversation with an emissions mandate reduction, right? Emissions reduction mandate. A lot of the EJ and climate justice movements across the country have long opposed systems like cap and trade and other forms of market-based mechanisms. But for us, if we could tie a emissions reduction mandate to a progressive polluter fee, we saw that we would be addressing two major problems in New York State. One was a mandate, and the other is how do you pay for the just transition? So the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that passed last year had a number of guardrails that were instituted to protect, not just to protect, but to also invest in communities of color. There is a mandate in the CLCPA that no less than 35% of all clean energy funding should be directed to frontline communities disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. There were even labor standards that we had in the bill that got dropped on in the closing days of the session because we were told a large bill, a labor bill was coming that was going to take care of all of this. A number of us reluctantly agreed to let it drop because we were like, labor got this. We're going to trust the process, and that bill didn't happen. So we are continuing to work with our brothers and sisters in labor. The next phase of our fight is the polluter fee. It's a bill that's for now called the Climate and Community Investment Act that seeks to impose a polluter fee that we'll probably need to raise it, because it was, when we first wrote the bill, it was at $35 per ton. We're recognizing that's probably an insufficient amount, but even at $35 a ton, preliminary estimates show that we would be looking at possibly $7 billion a year, which sounds like a lot until you look at the actual need for New York State to execute a just transition is closer to $30 billion a year. I'll stop there. I think probably the most important aspect for the purposes of this conversation are the jobs numbers that are projected, right? Based on the Cuomo administration's own numbers, the expectation is that this law will generate in the excess of 170,000 jobs in the coming decades. So it's real, it's here, and we're really looking forward to working with labor on the next aspect of our campaign. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you all for all of your really amazing comments. We think about kind of, as we hear from what folks are saying, there is almost a framework that we can think about that we actually, in some ways, we know what we need to do for just transition, right? Sam, you're mentioning what other countries are doing and the labor protections and worker protections that are needed. Michael, through the Just Transition Listening Project, you're hearing what people need. And John, your idea of a bigger table, we are all on the same side focusing together. And Eddie, you laid out this really amazing roadmap of kind of how New York Renewed came to this really the top of the nation kind of climate policy. And yet we're not really see it happening on a wide scale, right? In some ways we know what we need to do, but we're not doing it. And I wonder if for each of you, if you have some thoughts on, as you're starting to do this work, how do you start to build labor community coalitions? How do you build the power necessary to kind of advocate for these changes? And, given also the moment that we're in where there's going to be a wide scale recession where funds will be really strapped, how do we start to make these moves on these, what I always need to do to move towards transition? Maybe Sam, we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So whether you need a coalition, whether you have a coalition or not, really depends on the power relations in the country, right? So this German plan that I described was driven, there was a lot of heat from the environmental movement, which there was also a desire from big parts of the labor movement to find a way forward on coal, but they weren't working together at all. They ended up in a government commission together. There were horrible fights. The process nearly fell apart a bunch of times, but in the end, they managed to reach unanimous agreement on a plan for just transition for the country on coal. And then they had some dissents from the environmental groups about the end date for coal-fired power, which was 2038, and the environmental groups thought it should have been sooner. So it's just to say that sometimes, indeed, everybody can be in the same tent, but maybe if the labor movement has a motto, and maybe also EJ groups, it's that conflict is not always bad. Like sometimes we have real things on which we disagree, and you're not always going to be able to be together on stuff. And that's not necessarily bad, right? That's how you move forward is sometimes by fighting it out. In other countries, so just to give an example right now from Brazil, because we just were talking with the comrades at CUT Brazil, which is the national federation in Brazil. It's the equivalent of AFL-CIO. It's the biggest labor federation in Latin America, biggest in Brazil. And also now in the crosshairs of the Bolsonaro regime, because the labor movement is associated with the party that was previously in power, the Workers' Party. So they have, from the time they were founded in 1983 to fight against the military dictatorship together with the Workers' Party, they have had broad alliances with other social movements. And they continue to do that also on climate. So we have a project with them on climate and just transition. And a big part of that is working in alliances, especially in parts of the country that are favorable to them. I guess a couple of other thoughts about what does it take. It definitely, so in the real, to really make it happen at scale, you need a functioning national government that is somewhat friendly to labor And so there's a range of stuff like the big investments in infrastructure, interstate stuff or interprovince stuff. That actually has to happen at the national level. It doesn't mean the state and city level stuff isn't super important too, but really to get like the big result, you need both. I mean, I guess a couple of other thoughts, and just to pick up a bit on what some of the other speakers have said, we're talking a lot about energy and to some extent building efficiency, but really, like if we're going to do something meaningful about climate change, it is all jobs in all sectors, right? Like we're not just talking about coal and oil and gas and so on. We're talking all jobs in all sectors, some sooner than others. And in the same way, when you're looking for jobs for, let's say, coal workers or oil and gas workers, you have to look outside of the energy sector as well, right? You might look at other mining jobs for coal miners. You might look at skilled construction because they have good skills transfer. But you got to look at all jobs, and that means all jobs need to be good, and we need to be fighting for that as different movements. Some other things, we spend a lot of time trying to get employers and governments to the table. So that's one of the things we do when we work with unions. We have a table with another organization which consists of the world's biggest renewable energy companies who have all pledged high road standards in their supply chains and operations. You can imagine they're not always living up to that. And we're also working on starting a table, actually, to pick up on what you said, John, with oil and gas, European oil and gas companies that are now, like, they're looking for answers, right? So they're looking for how are we going to change the companies and, like, be enterprises in the future. And their workers are looking for how are they going to stay employed in a time when the bottom is falling out of the economy. I think the last thing to say about like why isn't it happening more? How do we get more? Like you need the national layer, you need the right freaking government, you need to like get the employers to the table basically by whatever means necessary. But maybe the biggest thing in this moment, I mean, we lost 400 million full-time jobs around the world between April and June, right? I mean, we're facing in most countries a bigger employment crisis, like a jobs apocalypse, bigger than anything we've seen before. And we're still in the middle of the biggest public health crisis pandemic ever. So when we're talking to our members about just transition, that conversation starts with jobs. And it then like continues and ends with social protection, like unemployment insurance, healthcare, all of the things that are helping families to keep afloat in this time. And I do think that if we want to seize this moment, and it is a moment where things can be much worse than they are right now, they could also potentially be much better. We have to have climate action that is red. That's, so we would say in Europe, red as in social, speaking to people's core concerns, building a welfare state. And we have to have social action that is green, that has climate action. So you have to have both things if you really want to see it get better. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Sam. But functioning national government sounds nice. John?
Mijin, if I can just follow up on my comments a little bit earlier, how as we transition, we realize that we need to retrofit a lot of the dirty, polluting plants. And ones that with companies that are looking towards cleaner technology. One is Danskammer Energy that has a proposed plant, high efficiency gas plant in Orange County. Right now, there's a project labor agreement signed with the building trades. There's 500 union construction jobs on the line. And right now they're calling to stop it. That plant, those gas turbines are actually made to accept 30% hydrogen right from day one, with the intention of eventually retrofitting to 100% hydrogen, zero emissions. And how it impacts the industry, these are good union jobs that will remain. But it's important to realize, to have that conversation, that what you want to do is you want to close the dirty peakers. You want to build high efficiency plants that only run as a backup if offshore wind and renewables can't do the job for the time being. But again, that's a conversation that is emotionally charged. Some people don't want to hear it, but it's important to have these discussions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Eddie and Michael, do you have thoughts on how we can start to actualize this?
Anyone?
Michael first.
Yeah. So first, I couldn't agree more with what Sam was saying earlier about, it's more than just energy jobs and fossil fuels. I mean, we can't talk about dealing with climate change if we're not talking about public transit. That's facing an existential crisis in this country. The hospitality sector, when United Here has 95% of its workers out of work right now, the public sector that's under constant attack, and the postal service right now under attack. All of those are good paying jobs right now that are really important. And then also the fact that a lot of workers that are in the fossil fuel industries may not actually want to work in energy anymore, right? They may want to do something else. And that's one of the things that we're also finding. What do they really want to do with their lives, and what kind of livelihoods and careers do they want to have? So creating a range of jobs and good work and livelihoods is going to be really critical for this effort. The one thing I would say that I think that's really important is that labor and community need to drive the process. We can't be waiting around for the government to come up with the solutions. We can't be waiting around for the private sector to do it. Labor and community need to drive the process, and it's already paying off. When we talk about in LNS, we talk about the labor climate movement. Used to be very small just a couple of years ago. Now we have the climate jobs effort. BGA is doing work on different things. The Thrive agenda that was passed or introduced a couple of weeks ago, right? 7 national unions signed on to that. So it is happening. These kind of collaborations, we're not all going to agree. That we're going to have to struggle out a lot of these tough questions, and we need to create spaces like this where we can hash those kind of things out. But that's where the change is going to come. If you look at places like Colorado that, established a just transition office and trying to create a just transition fund, those are the kind of things that we could start to do in terms of being proactive and coming up and not waiting around until plants start shutting down and jobs start getting lost. We need to start getting ahead of this, and that means that labor and community need to start coming to the table now.
Great. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
Eddie?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Just 3 quick reactions. One is Sam's point about a functioning national government makes me practically nostalgic and wistful. What can I tell you? What's interesting is that when we were launching New York Renews, we, like the rest of us, had expected a functioning national government and starting at the end of 2016, early 2017, right? But even still, we recognize the scale of the problem was such that even a national commitment would need local and state aggressive action. At least that's how and in some ways, thank God, we weren't relying on a national strategy. And what became clear to us after 2016 was that any progressive action was going to have to come from the local and state levels. So again, thankfully we did. And ironically, because we did what we did in New York Renews, you'll see the Biden plan and the Senate Democrats Climate Caucus components of their plans are directly informed by what we did in New York Renews, by their own admission. So here we have actually local and state progressive vision influencing national policy and direction. So that was grateful to hear. 2 other quick things. One is I don't see how we do this without coalition work, right? I mean, folks keep mentioning this is an economy-wide, deep layered problem throughout the DNA of our society. You can't get to a solution without an effective coalition. And to put a finer point on that, a coalition that doesn't center racial justice and economic justice and worker rights and the rights of people of color is going to miss the mark every time. If we need no other reminder of just how insidious structural racism is, look how COVID is playing out. Okay. So, when you look at systems and you look at the disproportionate ways people of color and low income working people are affected, you can almost time your clock on it. Any systemic attack on us will disproportionately affect communities that have long been denied equal access. So if we're not centering that stuff, we're not centering racial justice, we are missing it. And we're going to miss the opportunities for the kind of transformational change I hope we all want.
Great. Thank you, Eddie. Jeff, I want to make sure that we have time for questions for the audience. Are there questions from the audience?
Thanks, Mijin. We do have a number of questions. We probably have time for one. We've got a few minutes left. And this is framed in sort of a specific way, but it gets at a point that we certainly hear a lot. One of the panelists mentioned jobs first, training later. What are the mechanisms to coordinate the two? I'm thinking of PLAs that help unions plan and scale up training.
Yeah, I would say that's a part of it. I think the work that the Climate Job Center is doing is really critical to that, right? Is that let's not wait around for jobs to be created. Let's define what those jobs need to be. So that's one aspect of it. New York Renews is doing the same thing, and it's happening in different parts of the country. Those PLAs are going to be critical, and any of the laws and regulations that we can strengthen that are going to allow workers to be able to organize in existing and new industries are all going to be critical moving forward. That's why you can't separate out these issues. You can't separate out, like Eddie is saying, addressing racial justice, workers' rights, and climate. All of those things have to be addressed in the same set of policies, or else if one area of that falls short, then the whole thing really kind of collapses and we lose our potential for unity. So let's get unified around all of those things right now, and then we define those things rather than waiting around and letting the fossil fuel industry decide it for us and really try to divide us on some of these things.
And Jeff, if I would mention again, I think we need to look no further than the New York City building trades model under the leadership of Gary LaBarbera. It is a model of diversity and inclusion, as witnessed by the recent PLA signed with New York City, where high percentages of every apprenticeship class are direct entry from non-traditional employment for women, the New York City Housing Authority, helmets to hard hats, and vocational schools in New York City. But all the building trades needs is a pipeline of work. We need a pipeline of work under a PLA, and we'll be able to provide those opportunities and fuel the economic engine.
So one other thing that we see with jobs and skills, everyone loves to talk about skills because they don't want to do the heavy lifting to create new good jobs, right? So I'm not always so patient when I hear this discussion about skills. But two things. First of all, like working people should not have to pay to be reskilled for a new job. Why should we be paying for that? So that's something, and the skills should be developed between, let's say, labor management cooperation with either the company or the government paying for it. You should be able to get reskilled while you're in work, right? And you should get compensated time off while you're getting skilled. So there are a lot of issues about who pays for it, what's fair for working people when you're looking at skills. But indeed, community benefits agreements like the PLA that you're describing, or broader agreements like you have in Canada and British Columbia, those are also really important to fulfill another purpose of just transition, which is making the economy more fair, including marginalized people and communities into work, and eradicating poverty.
That's all. Is that all the time we have, Jeff?
That is, I'm afraid, that's all the time we have.
Thank you all so much. This has been such an enriching discussion, and I'm so grateful for you for sharing your stories and for your knowledge. We all know there's a transition coming, and it's up to all of us to make it just. And I'm so grateful to be here with you and really admire all the work that you're doing. So we'll take a short break, and then in 10 minutes, the concurrent sessions will run. So we'll see you then. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mijin. Thanks, everybody.